Welcome to the Online Business Launchpad podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Trudy Rankin. And today I have counseling and clinical psychologist Katrina Streatfeild with me. And she's been on the podcast before several times. And I love having her on the podcast. I love having conversations with her. And you might not know this, but her episode on Beyond Burnout is the most listened to episode of all the podcast episodes I've ever done. So that's episode 117, Beyond Burnout, basically what your future could be. So if you're interested in that, go and have a listen to that. But today we're going to be talking about something that some of the listeners have actually reached out and asked us to talk about. And that is how to deprogram your limiting beliefs. Now, if you've been in the business of business for any length of time, you'll know that one of the biggest barriers to success is actually your own brain and what goes through your own brain, because we all have these mindsets and thoughts that actually stop us doing the things we know we need to do so that we can grow our businesses to the size we want, so that we can have the life that we want, all the different things that we'd like to have in life. Oftentimes, our limiting beliefs are the ones that stop us doing that. And Katrina and I were just talking before we started recording this podcast episode about some of the things that bother us. But before we get into that, I just want to say hi, Katrina, and thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me as always. It's always wonderful to have these discussions that people find really helpful and interesting. Get people thinking about themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly find them useful. So basically, in terms of, limiting beliefs, I think we all have them. It'd be a very rare person who doesn't have limiting beliefs. And I know for myself, just one of the examples I was chatting with Katrina about, we started out by talking about it as though it's a limiting belief around money. Now, for those of you who don't know me so well, I grew up in a small country town, mostly until I was an early teenager. My father was a local GP. We always had nice cars. And I always felt super weird about it. The fact that we stuck out because we were better off than most of the people around us. And it just felt really awkward. And I did not realize until much, much later in life, probably not that long ago, that it's not about the money. It's about the fact that when you're successful at something, the limiting belief for me is that I can't be successful because then you'll be awkward and you'll stand out. And what about all those other poor people who aren't, as far along as you are and whatever. And so that's been something that I've actually had to work quite hard on, because you can end up self-sabotaging yourself when you want to do something and then you don't because of this limiting belief.
I think there's a limiting belief behind it, which is, do I deserve it? Am I good enough for this? Does it make me arrogant or think I'm better than other people if that's what I want?
I think that's it. It's not so much about the money or do I deserve it. It's more like, is it going to turn me into a jerk? Does that mean I'm going to have an inflated ego and view of myself and stop being able to be empathetic with people?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Or does it somehow, I guess the word arrogant comes up, doesn't it? Will it make me arrogant? Or it's almost like, I think for women, it's almost like survivor guilt. Like, out of all the people I know that are trying really hard, do I deserve to get the money? Like, what if I'm doing okay? And then all these other people that I'm supporting, what does it mean? Like, we have this guilt about being successful.
Yeah, actually, that's probably a good way of putting it. It isn't so much about the money. It's more about the success side of things. But money is a huge aspect of that. Money is a huge factor in that. Katrina, what about you? What might be one limiting belief that you've got?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that most people, like myself, would have a really good long list to choose from. Interestingly, though, I think it's worth saying that sometimes we don't realize that we have a limiting belief. And when we get stuck, it's always good to just stop and check in on that, because there's often, a list there that perhaps we're not aware of, as you said, once you start talking about it. But I think my work and my practice, one of the things that I've struggled with is feeling that what I have to offer is valuable. I think in an industry like mine, where there is a lot of very learned, voices and people who are very good at doing what they do, that you do wonder whether you have something to say that's valuable or different perhaps to other people, or whether you feel that you're just repeating things that people have heard before. So I think that was a really interesting thing for me to think about and overcome in terms of perhaps doing this podcast with you, or perhaps in presenting to, say, other people in my industry, or in, putting together pieces of information that we variously, put on the internet or other places. So, yeah, that's been an interesting thing for me to realise is going on and to try and overcome.
And I think you're right. People there's a long list of potential limiting beliefs that people have. And especially in the world of business and small business owners, solopreneurs, especially for women, I think the two that we've mentioned tend to be ones that I hear about a lot from people when I'm talking to other business owners. And I know what I've struggled with, and you know what you've struggled with. So maybe could you just talk a little bit about how to go about basically doing that thing that we talked about? How do we deprogram our limiting beliefs so that they don't have that power over us to stop us moving forward?
I think whenever we talk about, where to from here in these podcasts, Trudy, the first thing that I always seem to mention is stopping and noticing, because we do tend to get caught up in our very busy lives and we get on with things. And as you say, we're sometimes engaging in self-sabotaging behaviour that is habitual and we don't even see it. So I do think that the first thing to do in any situation like this is to just stop and take stock and give yourself some time to reflect on the things that you're wanting to do that you don't seem to be able to get to. Often they're things that I guess might present as not making sense to you, or feeling powerless or a bit stuck around, to even just, stop and jot those things down and have a think about what it is that is actually getting in the way. I think, when we were talking earlier, just before we started the podcast, you'd mentioned something and I asked you a couple of questions and you went, oh, yeah, okay, that might be where that's coming from. So, I think it's important to be able to stop and reflect and even try and challenge yourself to write down some of the goals that you've got that just don't seem to be happening, and to think about, what might be behind that in terms of your own beliefs. Whose voice in your head are you hearing that says, this is not okay, or you can't do this, or, what life experience have you had that perhaps, like you'd mentioned earlier, has taught you there's rules around this? Because often these rules that we've built, or these other people's kind of voices or criticisms or expectations in our head, really ours. But until we stop and realise where they've come from, we often assume that they are true or they are our voice. So I think that's the first thing to do, is to notice and to work through those. And I think once you realise those things are at play, you can begin to notice those coming up in your daily life, in your head, and they're then creating that situation creates what I call choice moments. And choice moments really are where you've caught yourself doing something that is not particularly helpful. And that is literally the moment when you get a choice about what happens next, that you can continue as you have, if that's your choice, or perhaps, forgot to notice and it happens anyway, which is fine. You forgive yourself and move on. Or perhaps you catch yourself with this voice in your head and you might say, okay, well, this time, I choose to do something different, and to begin to think about what that might be for you. So perhaps rather than the critical voice in your head, you'd like to say something compassionate to yourself. Show up for yourself as who you would be for, say, your best friend or somebody that you cared about, and, talk to yourself in that manner instead of a kind of critical voice or experience you've had in the past that's led to these unhelpful expectations and rules. And I think that's a really, really important part of shifting things.
Mm-hmm. I want to just touch on that just a little bit, that whole concept of using a compassionate voice, because we've talked about this before, and we've talked about that whole nasty, mean voice in your head. that's saying horrible things to you that you would never say to anybody else ever. And so just that concept, or that visual concept of when you start to hear that voice in your head, see if you can flip it and think, hang on, I'm talking to myself, but would I talk to my friend like that? No, never. What would I say to my friend? I like that. I really like that. So we've stopped and noticed, and we've realized that we now have the ability to make a choice when we notice that this limiting belief has popped up. Then what comes next?
I think that it's important to have something that you will say to yourself in those choice moments to move forward that is compassionate and different. I think it's actually important to write those down, or to have that kind of sentence or statement that you're going to say to yourself quite well practiced and thought about before the moment. You don't learn to ride your bike in the Tour de France, as they say. You need to have those compassionate things known before the choice moment, because often in the choice moment we can be quite emotional as well. I think those emotions that come up when we're stuck in those unhelpful places, or we're hearing those unhelpful voices, can be a little bit of an alarm to say, hey, this is not going well, stop, and maybe this is a choice moment. And then to be able to say these useful things to yourself, and to take a deep breath and calm down some of that emotion, because it can be difficult in the moment if your emotional self is more present than that wise mind. So sometimes it can be really helpful to just have those little statements pre-ordered, pre-prepared, so that they're easier to use in the moment. And it is a bit of pushing through discomfort, because when we do something different, it's often uncomfortable. And sometimes people, I think, mistake that discomfort for a stop sign, but it's actually not. It's transitional discomfort. So it doesn't mean the strategy isn't working or to stop this change that you're trying to undertake. It means just sit with that discomfort, because it's actually about the change itself, not about the strategy not being helpful. So I think that's a good thing to remember. It will be uncomfortable. And I think just to be aware that sometimes when you do these things, the people around you don't necessarily like the change. Sometimes whatever you've been doing that you feel like is kind of unhelpful for you might be quite helpful for the people around you. And so to just be aware, and I guess expect that it's okay if it becomes a little bit uncomfortable with other people around you. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a stop sign, don't do this, it's not working. Sometimes it means it is working. It's just that transitions can be uncomfortable. So I think that's a second thing just to remember as we're going through that. And I think once we start to challenge ourselves and get some useful voices in our head, and we're learning to breathe and just give that biofeedback to our body that we are safe when we're not under threat and we can calm down. And once we get that happening, then it's much, much easier to move forward in a way that we feel is proactive, is a choice, is perhaps more determined by our gut feelings, and aligned with our body, not necessarily what's going on in our head. It's easier then to make those value-aligned decisions about how we want to move forward, to allow processes to happen a little bit more by perhaps attrition when we show up as ourselves, rather than showing up as how other people have said that we should turn up in the past. And I think from there, what happens next is about accepting and cueing into that and trusting that process, so that we're moving in a direction that's right for us and who we actually are, rather than who everybody else has told us we should be.
I'm just curious, because change and making change happen and changing your limiting beliefs is a process of change. How long does it, comes back to that question about how long does it take to develop a new habit? Because you're changing your habits here. Can you just talk about that for a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. Be prepared to hang in there for the long haul. I'll call it shift. or transition. I often liken shift and transition when I'm talking to my clients a little bit like the beach, that moving on is like, the waves in the ocean, but the tide's slowly coming up in the background. So there's going to be lots of trips and falling over and forgetting and whatever. But in the background, the tide will slowly be coming up towards where you want to be. And I think even once you've been through this kind of process or you're aware of it, you'll always trip up, particularly under stress, because the more stressed we are, the less reflective we are, and the more we kind of fall back into automatic habits that are driven by that fear and emotion that comes up in those times. So I think we need to be prepared that it's a bit of a lifestyle change, a bit like quitting smoking or changing a diet or exercise. It is a little bit of a lifestyle change, and it takes a long time. And the longer you've been practicing your unhelpful stuff and the more entrenched it is, the longer it's going to take. So I think it's difficult to give a timeline that would apply to everybody, or even to the various unhelpful beliefs within the same person, because it really depends on how much we're hanging on to those things and how quickly we can catch ourselves. And the more emotion that's involved, the harder it is to catch ourselves, the quicker we're going to accidentally forget to notice. So I think that idea about being compassionate and patient and just seeing as a bit of a lifestyle change can be really useful ways of thinking about, how you move forward. There will sometimes be things that are so stuck and complicated that I would kind of say to people, look, how about you go get some professional support kind of with that? Because if there's been really big stuff happen in our life, we might feel like they're not things that we can think about by ourselves safely, and that's okay. You can go and get help with that for people who are trained in helping with this sort of stuff. And I would encourage people to do that if they feel that they need to. A safety thing there that we always need to think about. But yeah, so I think rather than giving a timeline, I think it's just really important to realise that it's a bit of a lifestyle change. It's just a mental health lifestyle change. That initially, like a habit, that the 40-day kind of rule, even initially, you wouldn't expect anything to happen kind of straight away. It is a bit of hard work, but it is an ongoing thing that is, I guess, a permanent change in the way that you think about yourself or notice yourself.
I think it's kind of interesting because I don't know why, but while you were saying that, the image that flashed up into my head was my granddad, who smoked for 35 years. And he was finally able to stop, but he only was able to do it by substituting a habit of chewing gum, which, because my grandparents ended up living with us for a number of years, it used to drive my mother crazy because I ended up liking gum myself. I like chewing gum. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. So you end up acknowledging that it is a very big change in our lives. And it might not sound like it, but our limiting beliefs, they're really deeply embedded. And so it is a big change. And it can take a while for us to get to the place where we're practicing this habit. And sometimes we fall down and forget to tell our nasty, mean voice to say something different, to be compassionate to ourselves. And then basically get to the stage where more and more of the time we are compassionate to ourselves. We are starting to believe much more strongly that we can be that person who we would like to be without the limiting belief. That's really quite powerful.
I think too, it's helpful sometimes, Trudy, to just remember that critical voice is very rarely ours. And it's a small distinction, but I think it's quite powerful that this voice that we feel it doesn't make us feel good about ourselves, is very rarely actually our voice, very rarely originated from us. So it's not actually us being mean to ourselves. It's actually us taking on board what other people have said. But I think there's something really powerful in realizing that that's not actually who I am, that this compassionate person underneath that voice was who I was all along, and that these criticisms and expectations and rules that have built up over my life from, all the things that have happened to me are not actually me or mine. Like, I'm okay. I was always okay. It's not about what's wrong with me. It's about what's happened to me, and that I am okay. I just need to give myself space to learn to be me and to not take on board the other things. And I think when we talk about good mental health from a place of not feeling so good to get into good mental health, there's different ways and paradigms that people think about that. But in my particular work, I really like the analogy that we've all been there all along as ourselves, that really my work, say as a psychologist with people, is helping them remove the layers that get in the way of them seeing who they are, rather than actually fixing anything about them, because they are actually okay. This deficit is not in them. It's about what's kind of happened to them in a lot of circumstances. And sometimes, obviously there's genetic unwellness that we need to deal with in different ways, whether it's medication or whatever else, and that's okay. But, having said that, as it be, like, that's just like having, type 1 diabetes, right? Sometimes there are those sorts of illnesses that are about your body, and we'll deal with those. But aside from those sorts of things, and even people who struggle with those things, I mean, that's an illness, but as a person themselves, they are a whole wonderful person. And we really, this process is lovely in that it's really just about allowing that, I don't know, the image that comes to my mind is almost a flower to bloom, removing the things that are stopping that happening. And I think that's a nice analogy that can be quite powerful to think about.
That is very powerful. And it's a very liberating way of thinking about that whole, I'm okay underneath all of those limiting beliefs. And I love that thought that it's actually not my voice. It's what I've been told when I was growing up. That's actually it's just liberating. That's all I can say about it. That's a really, really fantastic way of thinking about it. Katrina, it's just been so great talking about this and just being able to just talk about a whole bunch of things around deprogramming our limiting beliefs, whether it's about us as a person and how we operate, or whether it's us in our roles as business owners. It doesn't really kind of matter. Just being able to focus on deprogramming those limiting beliefs is going to actually be very liberating. So once again, if people are interested in getting in touch with you or basically want to learn more about you, where will they go?
I think the first place they could go is just to our website, which is www.streatpsych.com, and that's street spelled with STREAT, not double E. Yep. Is always the first point of call, and that's our clinic website, and people can always get in touch with me through the details on there.
Fantastic. And I'll put those in the show notes. But thank you again for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Trudy. Always a pleasure.